So a few years ago, I was driving into a building committee meeting one night at church, and that sounds simple, but in our house it was complicated. At the last minute, I realized my son needed to mow a lawn in the little subdivision just east of town, Meadow Gardens, and so we had to load up the lawnmower and the trailer and get in, and I was frustrated that I was going to be late, and so we drove all the way to the end of the subdivision, the dead end at the end of Meadow Gardens, and I jumped out of the car to go unload the lawnmower, and much to my surprise, there was a blue car with flashing lights parked directly behind me for some reason. When that happens, a lot of thoughts go through your mind. My first thought was that in driver's training, they told me that police do not like it when you jump out of the car and walk back towards them when they pull you over. And so I quickly stopped myself and said, I had some time for thinking. And so the officer and we had a little chat. Then he went back to his car, as is his custom. And I discovered that he felt that I was speeding. And that I had expired tabs on my license plate. And as I sat there in quiet reflection, there were many thoughts that went through my head. I thought, man, it was only 2 miles. How fast could I have been going? I thought, what a good lesson for my son to observe this. So this is really a good thing. I thought, why are the tabs in my wife's purse instead of on the car? It went through my mind. I thought, aren't there worse criminals that they ought to be bothering than myself in this moment? And lastly, and probably the thing that you thought firstly, I thought, I am a pastor on my way to church. How could I possibly be guilty before this officer? My inner lawyer is very good at rationalizing my actions. Rationalization, I think I have a definition even here, is, wow, look, there's the whole sermon. Maybe we'll be done in 10 minutes. Maybe. Rationalization is the attempt to explain or justify behavior with plausible, reasonable sounding explanations that are often untrue, or at least they don't explain or justify the behavior. And that is what I do, and I suspect that is what you do, and I think that is what is happening in Romans chapter 3, the chapter in Romans, the verses that we are to consider today. In Romans 1 through 3, over this last month, this month of contrition, we've been talking a lot about sin. How many of you are feeling the heaviness of sin resting on your shoulders as we've talked about sin, about God's wrath? It is kind of heavy. Pastor Chris, over these previous weeks, has talked about 3 groups who are justly the targets of God's wrath. In Romans 1, Paul made the case that mankind as a whole is deserving just of God's wrath. God has revealed his character in nature, and people would rather worship created things than the one who made it. And because of this, because people do not revere their Creator, they are subject to judgment. In Romans chapter 2, we talked about Gentiles who are good, who don't know the law, but do pretty well. They have a conscience. And Paul noted that people use their conscience often to judge others. But he said, whenever you do that, remember, you're judging yourself. Everyone with a conscience knows that they are not righteous, and so they are justly the targets of God's wrath. At the end of chapter 2, last week, Pastor Chris talked about the insiders, the Jews, those who are God's covenant people, chosen by Him, and who had the law, the prophets, as the first verse in Romans chapter 3 says, that they were entrusted with the very words of God. Surely they have the inside track to not be the targets of God's wrath. But even they, the law condemns them. It reveals the ways that they fall short of God's perfection. And it makes them aware of their sin, and so they are justly under God's wrath. Now, as we transition to Romans chapter 3, we have this new passage that is really Paul's final argument in the first big section of Romans on the nature of sin, the problem that we face as humans. One commentator I was so encouraged as I started my study today said, "This is one of the most difficult passages in the whole epistle." And I said, "Thank you, Chris, for giving me this passage to speak on." He's nice like that. They said that the difficulty lies is that this passage has a series of rapid-fire questions. And it's difficult to, as you read it, to say, is he speaking primarily to Jews or to Gentiles or to both? The questions that he asks, is he answering the logical implications of what he has said earlier? Or is there some opponent, somebody he's responding to, who is raising arguments that he feels that he is addressing? To be honest, as you read this, especially at your first reading of it, sometimes it's not even clear what exactly Paul is affirming is true and what he is holding up as patently false. He will just make a statement, and you're like, okay, maybe from the context I know, but it's not immediately clear what he's arguing for or what he is arguing against. And so we come to this passage, and as I've studied it, the brief overview that I would say is I believe Paul is speaking primarily to a Jewish audience and wrestling with their concerns about the law and sin. But he does it in such a way that there are clear implications for everyone who is reading his book, Gentiles alike. He's addressing Jewish concerns, but the implications for Gentiles are real, and especially when he gets to his conclusion, it affects us all. What he is dealing with, as I would suggest, are three arguments, three rationalizations, really, that attempt to minimize the significance of sin and ultimately of God's wrath. And just as we are today, those in the first century were good at rationalization. We're good at explaining and justifying our actions, or at least minimizing it, or at least casting the blame on someone else. Let's read. We're going to read verses 3 through 20. You'll see a series of questions, and then in the second half, a series of quotations from the Old Testament as Paul responds to three reasonings, three logical arguments that said, you know what, maybe my sin isn't so bad. Maybe it's justified. Maybe there's some others who are worthy of God's wrath, but not me. Romans 3, chapter 3. What if some did not have faith? Will their lack of faith nullify God's faithfulness? Not at all. Let God be true and every man a liar, as it is written, so that you may be proved right when you speak and prevail when you judge. Second argument. But if our unrighteousness, it's as if he says, what if someone says, but if our unrighteousness brings about God's righteousness more clearly, what shall we say? That God is perhaps unjust in bringing his wrath on us? I'm using a human argument. Certainly not, though. If that were so, how could God judge the world? It's as good as if someone might argue, if my falsehood enhances God's truthfulness and so increases his glory, why am I still condemned as a sinner? I say to you, why not say, as we are being slanderously reported as saying, and as some claim that we say, let us do evil that good may result. Their condemnation is deserved. What shall we conclude then? Are we any better? Not at all. We have already made the charge that Jews and Gentiles alike are all under sin. As it is written, there is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands, no one who seeks God. All have turned away. They have together become worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one. Their throats are open graves. Their tongues practice deceit. The poison of vipers is on their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery mark their ways, and the way of peace they do not know. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world held accountable to God. Therefore, no one will be declared righteous in his sight by observing the law. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of sin. Let's pray together. Dear Father, these are heavy words that strike like hammer blows, that some, as we listen to it, we say, that doesn't sound like us. I do pray that we would see ourselves as you see us, and that we would respond according to your call and your goodness and your grace. Help us to understand your word today. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. As I said, Paul, I believe, is addressing Jewish concerns that have implications for us as Gentiles. And the first argument that he makes, the first rationalization, is in verses 3 and 4, both the rationalization and his response. He says, "What if some did not have faith? Will their lack of faith nullify God's faithfulness?" Now, would you agree that might be difficult to wrap your mind around at first reading? What is he talking about? What if some lack faith? Will their lack of faith nullify God's faithfulness? I think if I were to paraphrase it for our understanding, it would be he is responding to some who might say, if some Jews don't have faith, does that mean God is not faithful to the Jews that he had made his chosen people if he judges them? If some Jews don't have faith, doesn't it mean that God kind of failed? That he was not faithful to bring them through to completion if he judges them? Aren't they God's people? Weren't they entrusted with the very words of God? And if they are not faithful to what God has done, hasn't God somehow let them down if they don't believe and obey? Paul answers this argument in two ways in this passage. Did God let them down? First of all, he says clearly, not at all. Let God be true and every man a liar. I think what Paul is addressing in this, his first argument, his first response to this is to say, who are you to put yourself over and above God to evaluate what his faithfulness ought to do? I think he's building on something we find back in Isaiah 29:16, and also he'll use later in Romans chapter 9, when he references a potter who's working with clay. In Isaiah 29:16, Isaiah writes to say, the people of Israel are like a clay pot who says, you know what, I don't like the way God is pressing and forming me. I had dreams of being a beautiful vase, and he's making me a common bowl. Does the clay have a right to accuse the potter of ignorance or of lack of autonomy to do what he wishes? Paul will revisit this in Romans chapter 9. What Paul is saying here in Romans 3 in a similar way is he said, you're going to impugn God's faithfulness? God is truth. Every man is a liar in light of God's holiness and his perfection. We have no standing to critique them. It's a little bit like a courtroom drama. I've liked, in recent weeks, I've been watching a couple of courtroom dramas that were interesting to me. And usually the courtroom drama is the prosecutor versus the defense attorney. Usually the dramas that I watch, usually it's the defense attorney that's the good guy in the situation. And one of the best parts of a courtroom drama is when the defense attorney can use the law, use an obscure law or the interpretation of a law to compel the prosecutor to do something, or even in some case the judge to prosecute to do something. That the defense attorney has a better view of the law, a better understanding of the law than the other side and even of the judge. Really, that's what rationalization at its heart is. It says, you know what? Here's the law, and here's God and me, And I am going to appeal to my reason and my logic and my rationalization to prove that I'm innocent before the law and God. And that the law, somehow I'm going to find the loophole that means it's okay what I'm doing. It's all right, that I'm justified in it. The reality is, and what Paul says, is God is truth. He is truth. The reality is the diagram is not the law and God and myself arguing under the law. God is the law embodied. In fact, it would be better to say the law flows from who God is. It is inherent. It originates with him and inherent in him. He is love. He is holy. He is mercy. He is grace. And he is justice. And so we have no standing to say, hey, I'm going to use the law against you. God is sovereign in the exercise of his justice and his mercy. And that leads us to the second argument that Paul makes there in the end of verse 4. So that you may be proved right when you speak and prevail when you judge. I believe what he's saying is that God's faithfulness, or actually better said, that people's lack of faithfulness doesn't show that God is unfaithful. The reality is God's faithfulness is just as visible in judging the wicked as in rewarding the righteous. His faithfulness is not a safety net that catches everyone regardless of their action, even the covenant people of God. He says that is not the way God's faithfulness works. His faithfulness is to his own character, his own holiness, justice, and mercy. And as he exercises his holiness, justice, and mercy, he does that according to his divine will that is the source of the law and rule that we follow. Sometimes judging the wicked and sometimes rewarding the righteous. God remains just, that he prevails when he judges because he is, as he has said previously in Romans, he is the creator. Everything comes and it flows from him. His divine nature is seen in what he has made, and we have no basis to think that we can trap him in a loophole to justify ourselves, that we can pit God against the law because he is the source of the law. You know, the phrasing of this rationalization is maybe one that we would not use, but there is a similar one that tries to use the character of God to explain away our disobedience. It goes like this. I think that God is so loving that he would not judge anyone in a meaningful way, at least not me or the folks that I favor, maybe some other folks. Sometimes it goes unsaid, but this kind of flows into a way of thinking but unsaid. Why doesn't God just lighten up about sin? You know, wouldn't you think more people would like God if he was a little bit easier on sin? All of these arguments tend to say, hey, I'm going to use God's character, and my understanding of God's character is better than his understanding of his character, and so I can trap him in my understanding of his character. In doing so, it places us over God. When I say that I know what his love should do, I know when he should exercise mercy, that I have a few ideas about who is worthy of judgment, I'm placing myself over God. What Paul says is, no, he defines love because it originates him. Holiness and justice are inherent in his nature. So is mercy, but no one has leverage over God to dictate how and when he exercises mercy. The good news is, we're just starting in Romans. And when we consider Romans as a whole, what it really is all about is to say, how can God's justice and his mercy coexist without his mercy invalidating his justice or his justice destroying mercy? That's what Romans is all about. The first rationalization says, man, if people don't have faith, it means God's unfaithful. And Paul says, by no means. God is always faithful. He is true. He is the source of righteousness, and we are evaluated against him. And we have no call to critique his justice. Rationalization number 2. Actually, this one appears in verses 5 through 8. Actually, there's two questions that Paul throws out, but they're really very parallel to each other, and so I think these are, he's using two different words to describe the same rationalization for clarity. In verse number 5, he says, but if our unrighteousness brings about God's righteousness more clearly, isn't God unjust if he brings his wrath on us? And then he says, man, that's a human argument right there. But then he repeats it in verse 7. If my falsehood enhances God's truthfulness and so increases his glory, why am I still condemned? I'm revealing God's glory with my dishonesty. Perhaps he repeats this because this one strikes closer to home. There does seem to be a reference that he has heard people say such things. And in fact, when he gets to Romans chapter 6, he's going to deal with this subject with more detail and precision. But here, the argument seems to be the rationalization, the justification says, if my sin better reveals God's righteousness, why would God judge me? I'm just creating a contrast that he can see his righteousness. If God is accomplishing his glory through his grace, how can I be accountable or responsible for what I do wrong? Once again, Paul gives a twofold response. He says, first of all, if this were true, God could not even judge the world. And unstated behind that is, you know that the world is worthy of judgment. If this were true, to say, man, God can't judge because, you know what, he has to be merciful. He says, no, God's hands are never tied by that. It is clear that the world is worthy of judgment. That's made the argument that I made in chapters 1 and 2. The Creator is revealed as eternal power and divine nature, but man has chosen not to worship his Creator, but rather other created things. God is the righteous judge, and his right to judge flows from him being the creator and originator of both the world and the moral structure of the universe. My sin, while it does reveal God's righteousness, it does not therefore justify my sin and my choices. Even as God's grace is at work in forgiving sins, it doesn't make a bad thing a good thing. If this were true, God could not judge the world. Secondly, Paul uses what philosophers would say as an argument to absurdity. This is when you disprove something by showing its logical consequences and saying, it's self-contradictory or it's just absurd when you reach its conclusion. In verse 8, he does this in his response saying, your argument leads somebody to say, hey, we should do evil because good is ultimately resulting from our evil. And Paul doesn't necessarily argue us, he just holds this up and says, isn't that absurd? That we would choose to violate the character of God in order to reveal the character of God. And that means that we are innocent. Instead, he says, their condemnation is deserved. That argument is ridiculous as in justifying stuff, what we do that violates the plan of God. That rationalization maybe takes some other forms. Sometimes we might say, if my sin is part of God's plan, he can't blame me. For all the high-sounding words, the end result of this argument is to say, I want to sin, but I don't want to experience God's wrath. I want to do my will, not God's will, but I want to do it without consequence. That's the way rationalizations work. It's tend to justify myself. But Paul kind of cuts through the rationalization. He uses the machete, not the scalpel, to say, that is absurd, that you're going to justify yourself, and in so doing, make God unjust by needing to not judge sin, and it is patently false. If my sin better reveals God's righteousness is proved perfect and holy and just, but it does not justify my actions. And if my sin is a part of God's plan, I am still accountable for it because I have chosen it. It was my will. It was not compelled by God. And the good news is not that my sin is rationalized away. The good news is that Jesus has an answer for sin. That is the good news of the gospel. Let's turn to rationalization number 3. Rationalization number 3, Paul says, what shall we conclude then? Are we any better? Not at all. We have already made the charge that Jews and Gentiles alike are all under sin. Now, if you have a good memory, you may recall that this chapter begins in verse 1 with, seems very similar. What advantage then is there being a Jew? Or what value is there in circumcision? And in verse 1 and 2, he says, well, there is some advantage. We have been entrusted with the very words of God. The people of Israel have been entrusted with God's promises. Jesus comes from a Jewish background. They are God's covenant people. He's accomplishing salvation through this people. And so, yes, there is an advantage. But here, with slightly different language, he says, what shall we conclude? Are we any better off? Are Jews, do they have some advantage over Gentiles? And he gives the opposite answer here. And you might say, man, this seems contradictory. But really, you have to understand the context. In verse 1, he's saying, yes, it is a wonderful thing that the people of God, Old Testament Hebrews, extending into the New Testament and Jesus' ministry on earth, it is wonderful if they have experienced the very words of God. But in verse 9, he's saying, so does that give them some special inside track? Are they an advantage because they have received these word of God? Or is it possible that they're at a disadvantage? That because they've been given much, they're more accountable, so they're at a disadvantage. This is the heart of the argument. Who is more blameworthy? Jews who have the law or Gentiles who are ignorant of the law? Really, it's a tremendous rationalization. Believe it or not, this is one that you used when you were in elementary school. It really is. This is the exact same argument that says, hey, those kids over there, they misbehave all the time, and one time I talk out of turn, you yell at me. Why don't you deal with them over there? How many of you admit that you used that in elementary school? Someone? All right, there's some honest people here. This is an old argument of pitting of who is more unrighteous. It distracts from the issue because what it's really saying is their greater unrighteousness makes me innocent. And what Paul says, no, their greater unrighteousness or your lesser unrighteousness doesn't make you innocent. It just makes your sin take a different shape, a different form. It doesn't really justify, even if it explains. Do Jews have an advantage, or are they penalized for being a part of God's family? Are they penalized because they've been entrusted with the various words of God? No, Paul says. I have been making the case in these first 3 chapters of Romans that we are all under sin. We are all under sin. And so the comparison game does not work. Then he does a series of quotes that are designed to show how from the Old Testament sin is pervasive, widespread, dangerous, damaging, destructive, and it extends to everyone. Really, and even in these arguments, you don't have to look too hard to see other rationalizations that people use for sin. While Jews have been the conduit of God's promises, everyone is alike under sin and the power of sin. And then in these quotes, to the one who says, at least I'm better than them, Paul says, there's no one righteous, not even one. There's no one who understands. No one seeks God. No one's righteous. Do you seek God on your own, or do you seek yourself? There's no one righteous. To the one who says, everyone does it. It's just normal. That's just the way the world works. And our day, you can't expect anyone to live on those moral rules from centuries ago. This is normal. Paul says, no, all have turned away. They have turned away and have together become worthless. It was a choice that is making. Sin is turning away from a good God whose moral law flows from his righteous character that doesn't change as culture change. It remains consistent, that righteousness is, and we have all turned away. And so there's no one good, no one who does good, not even one. To the one who says, my sin is harmless. As long as I don't hurt anyone, what does it really matter? Paul makes the case that sin is deadly dangerous. Their throats are open graves. Their tongues practice deceit. The poison of vipers is on their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Just think of the damage that is done with your speech. Deceit, cursing, poisonous words, bitterness. James 3 explores this further, and it says, James writes, anyone who is never in fault in what he says, that is a perfect person, righteous in all that they do. And then he goes on to say how words are amazing. You speak them out, and they're in the air, and then they just disappear. But their consequences, they last much longer. They're like a fire that started with a little spark that spreads, a little lie, a little piece of gossip, the damage that it does. Poisonous words that take root in someone's soul and corrupt the relationship, corrupt their view of themselves, bitterness. Paul says, no, sin is deadly dangerous. Don't deceive yourself that there's no harm, no foul. To the one who says, hey, my sin is not that bad, Paul says, no. You know what sin is? Sin is feet rushing to shed innocent blood, ruin and misery marking their way, people denying the way of peace. Apart from this is one where it's. I feel like there's distance. We read this as respectable people. We have a lot of respectable people here, don't we? Yeah, you don't know how to answer that question, really. Feels like a trap, doesn't it? I don't do that. I am not in a rush for violence. That's not me. Think about this one culturally. What happens when we say, "Hey, let's remove law and order. Let's, defund the police"? What happens as a result when there's no law and consequence, when there's no justice? It increases. Violence occurs quickly. Actually, if you want to extend back to the Old Testament, we say the sin that led to the flood, it says the earth was filled with violence. Apart from the restraining influence of law and consequence, violence comes very, very quickly. The desire for mastery over or profit and using other people. Paul says the inherent nature of sin is that it so quickly can turn to violence. It is marked by ruin and misery because people don't choose peace, they choose their will and their way. And then he concludes by saying, there is no fear of God before their eyes. The ultimate problem with sin is it doesn't recognize God as who he is, that he is powerful and mighty and good, and he is worthy and deserving of our reverence and obedience. And those who are unwilling to recognize that, whatever they do, it is not marked, it is not good. It is sin, it is evil, and it is worthy of God's wrath. This passage in Romans chapter 3 is one of the foundation passages for a doctrine that I would say is often misunderstood. It's the doctrine of total depravity. Theologians would say that man in his natural state apart from God is totally depraved, totally broken and bent away from God. And people say, man, I'm not sure that's true. I know good people who do good things, and they don't know God. What exactly does Paul mean as he says that there is no one righteous? What exactly does that mean? Well, maybe it'll help if we talk about three things that total depravity does not mean, and three things that it does mean. Total depravity. First of all, it does not mean that every person is as wicked as they possibly could be. When we as Christians say that people are totally depraved, we are not saying that everyone indulges in all forms of wickedness. It does not mean that everyone is as bad as they possibly could be. But by nature, people turn from God. The psalmist says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. But people don't seek God. They worship created goods over the Creator's good. Total depravity does not mean that every person is as wicked as they possibly could be. Secondly, it does not mean that every person is totally insensitive to conscience. When we see people are totally depraved, that we, apart from Christ, our neighbors who are without Christ, it does not mean that we're saying that there is no conscience. Really, that was the argument of Romans chapter 2. That Paul said, the conscience is God's law written on people's heart. That internal sense of right and wrong that comes from our Creator that resides in all of us. And so when we say that people are totally depraved, it doesn't mean that they are unaware of right and wrong, that they're insensitive to it. They're aware of it, but they don't choose to do good for the right reason. And that's leads us to the third thing, that it does not mean that every person does every possible sin. That over the course of the life, being totally depraved, that everyone will indulge in every type of sin that's here in Romans chapter 3 or a violation of the Ten Commandments. That's not what depravity means, that every person does every possible sin. What it does mean is three things. One is that sin affects the total person, everything about us. It affects our will, how we choose. It affects our mind, how we think, our emotions, how we feel. It affects our bodies. All of them have been corrupted by sin. We don't choose to do the right things for the right reasons. The mind, we have the tremendous ability to rationalize. My inner lawyer and your inner lawyer will justify doing things that our conscience would tell us are wrong, but we will justify them to do them because sin has affected our entire persons. It even means that our emotions can't be trusted. That what feels right is not necessarily right. It is a fallible guide to right and wrong. Everything about us, even our bodies, are corrupted by sin. Our bodily desires lead us to be fulfilled in the wrong way or in disobedience to what God has revealed. Sin affects the entire person. Total depravity means, secondly, that even the best acts always contain improper motives. What that means is that even when people apart from Christ do what is good, there is something improper or impure in it because it is not done out of perfect love for God. The act itself might be good, but if it's marked by self-interest or not done to bring glory to God, there is something amiss. There's an impurity in it. There's improper motives. Even our best acts contains self-interest and not love for God. I was fascinated by this quote by a theologian by the name of Landon Gilkey, who says, when people choose to do things, they do not decide to do them because they say, this is the most reasonable and moral way to act, and so this is what I'm going to do. Instead, what people normally do is they choose a course of action that suits their self-interest, and then afterwards they find rational and moral reasons for what they'd already decided to do. That's the impurity of motives, that I say, I'll find a way to justify to my own heart or to others my actions, but I really do it because when it's a sinful choice, that's what I really want to do. There's an element of improper motive in even the best of acts. And in that sense, we are totally broken, totally bent away from God. Thirdly, when we speak of total depravity, it means that we are unable to escape our sinful condition on our own. It speaks not to the depth or breadth of our sinful actions, but of our inability to reach up to God and to be made right before Him. Our best actions tainted by self-love, nothing done consistently over time, all of us leaves us fallen short of God's perfect will. We are marked by sin. Paul sums up in verses 19 and 20, says, you know what? It says to those who are under the law, either the written law or the law written on your heart, the reality is that all of us are accountable to God. And the law is not good at making us righteous, but it does make us conscious of sin. You know, I have to tell you, I'm never excited to speak when Pastor Chris gives me passages like this. Because I do feel it kind of falls like hammer blows, talking about sin and how sinful we are, the impurity of our motives, and all of these things. It seems heavy and dark. And that's why we rationalize. That's why we say, you know what, I'm not as bad as some people. It's an attempt to rationalization is always an attempt to make peace with our sin. If I can justify myself to myself or justify myself to others, I don't want to feel guilty. Rationalization is an attempt to deal with our sin, but there's another way. There's another way to deal with our sin. You know, when I was pulled over by that officer a couple of years ago, I was guilty. And sometimes when you're guilty, I know that I'm not the only one who tells stories about being pulled over by cops. And you know, the best stories are the ones where you get off, aren't they? Those are the best ones. But often those are marked by, man, did the person kind of fudge the truth a little bit in this? Do I really feel good about the result of this? Why were they given mercy? Because there's this conflict that we feel internally that says, man, if they let everyone off, the roads and the world would be a disaster if everything was mercy. But I also, there ought to be justice, but I really want mercy. But I'm self-interested enough that I really want justice for you and mercy for me. To be honest, that's what I really want. But if I step back a little bit, I would like, if only there was a way for there to be justice and mercy. We're almost to that point in this sermon series. After all of Paul's argument to say that we are subject to God's wrath, that sin is real and it is devastating and dangerous, that it leads to death, it makes us subject to God's wrath. All of this case that he's building that has fallen on us again and again in this month of contrition. We're almost to verses 21 and 22 that says, I have good news. Now there's a righteousness that is apart from the law that's been made known. And this righteousness comes, in fact, it's given through faith in Jesus Christ. We choose rationalization far too often when God wants to offer something way better. Forgiveness. And a forgiveness that completely fulfills God's demands for justice, the demands of righteousness, but also displays perfectly and wonderfully His mercy and His grace. My rationalization can never do that. Our rationalization always leaves us with that nagging sense of guilt to say, I know that it is not right. But what God offers, a righteousness through faith to all who believe, perfectly exonerating God's justice, perfectly fulfilling His mercy, and epitomized in the person of Christ. And you know who gets the glory? You know, when I tell my story of getting off, I kind of get the glory. And I put one over on the cop when that happens, which it doesn't always happen. But when Christ perfectly fulfills God's justice and displays God's mercy, to take rationalizing sinners like me and say, no, I'm going to make you fully a part of my family, forgiven, adopted, justified, sanctified, then there's no guilt. There's no shame. There is a clear conscience before God and a true gratitude for Him and His glory and His grace.